Welcome, and thank you for choosing to spend some of your SEPA conference with us today. My name is Dr. Virginia Wickline. I'm in the Department of Psychology at Georgia Southern University, and it is my pleasure on behalf of myself and my research colleagues to present our work to you today as part of the Outstanding Paper and Presentation Award for SEPA. Now, I'm going to shrink down and disappear up into the corner for the remainder of the presentation. I find personally, when I'm processing a presentation, that it's easier for me to do that when I can see the presenter's face and get more of their person in addition to the presentation. However, for those of you that would like to disregard that, I'll just be tiny in the corner and you can focus on the presentation itself. So I hope you won't find my presence distracting, but I figured especially on a session about nonverbal communication, I would want to make as many options available for people who like to process all of those cues. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and share our research, The Eyes Don't Have It. Medical masks make reading emotion and facial expressions more difficult. This research was conducted with partners at several institutions, including Stephen Nowicki from Emory University, Michael Woodcock at Georgia Southern, and Marco Bani, Selena Russo, and Maria Grazia Stoprava at the University of Milano Bicocca. So it is our pleasure to present our work today, and thank you so much for the honor of including us in this special session. We have included the abstract for those who would like to pause the presentation and look at it in more detail. What I'm going to highlight today for our work is how reading faces gets harder when masks go on. And this might be related to certain characteristics for individuals that make that more difficult. And we'll look at some variations in emotion type and intensity as other things that can contribute to this picture. In the current time, in the spring of 2021, we are in the midst of a global pandemic with the coronavirus 2019, otherwise known as COVID-19. And a lot of organizations have recommended that people out in public wear masks to help slow or stop the spread of this disease. At the end of late February, when this recording was recorded, we have now over 500,000 deaths in the United States alone, with many more cases of COVID being diagnosed every day. And COVID-19 has been implicated in some form or fashion in nearly 2.5 million deaths worldwide. So clearly, we are struggling socially with an issue that we have not had to wrestle with before. And as a result, many organizations, from small businesses to governments, have implemented mask-wearing policies, either suggested or mandatory for individuals in their day-to-day lives when out in public, in addition to social distancing and keeping apart to help slow the spread. We are working towards immunity with exposure and with immunizations, but we are not out of the woods yet. And this is something that our societies are going to need to wrestle with, at least for the foreseeable future, and hopefully not for the long run. Now, mask wearing during COVID-19 is far from a neutral phenomenon. It's not just a matter of put on the mask or don't. We have a wide variety of perspectives, from very staunch supporters of mask wearing to those who are very strongly opposed to mask wearing. Everybody tends to find masks uncomfortable and a little bit annoying, right? But in addition to that discomfort, research is just starting to find and identify particular reasons why some people are more opposed to mask wearing than others. Some individuals find masks to be unmasculine and see them as a sign of weakness. They bring anxiety about people's susceptibility to catching the disease, whether they work or not, anxiety about the disease itself. And yet other individuals find masks to be a very strong imposition on their rights and personal freedom for what they decide to wear or do out in public. So these kind of things are not just about a medical decision or put a shirt on to go in the store. It goes much deeper. And we also know that mask wearing is having an effect on social relationships. We've all had that situation, I'm sure, where you had to ask someone to repeat themselves because you couldn't quite hear them because of the muffling of the mask. But in addition to an occlusion of the clarity of verbal speech, masks hide a lot of emotion. And so it's taking away a source of information in our everyday relationships. Now, a variety of research paradigms that have occluded or hidden part of the face with either a mask, a winter hat and scarf, a bubble or box that is technologically imposed over the face, or a niqab, an Islamic headdress that covers all but the eyes, have found that reading faces gets harder when that mouth section is blocked. And this is especially true for emotions like happy, sad, and angry. It does not seem to affect fear quite as much. So an image like this for fear is still somewhat easy enough for people to read, but a happy expression like this becomes much more difficult when the masks go on. What has not yet been studied in the research is whether different intensities of emotion become more difficult with masks. So we know in everyday life that high intensity emotions, like this one here, it's a fearful expression, are easier for people to read than a low intensity emotion or more subtle emotion. This is also fear, but most people have an easier time with this face than this face in interpreting what that person is feeling. But what we don't know is whether emotions of different intensity get significantly more difficult when those masks go on. We also have not explored very much yet what are the individual difference factors that might relate to people's facial recognition errors in both an unmasked and masked condition. One probable predictor of facial emotion recognition difficulties is locus of control. Now, locus of control is a personality variable that looks at where people look in the world to understand their behaviors and consequences. So people with a more external locus of control tend to believe that fate, God, or powerful others are in control of what happens to them. And individuals with a more internal locus of control tend to look to their own behaviors. I can control my destiny. I can do something different. And we know from the literature that people who are more externally controlled are more likely to make errors on facial expressions than people who are more internally controlled, especially for emotion types like anger and sadness. But again, we don't know what happens when the masks go on. We also wanted to explore whether people's mask wearing attitudes would relate to their facial recognition errors. Does what people believe affect what they see and how much they can process from emotions and faces? Now, we haven't found many mask wearing attitude measures, if any, in the literature yet. And so we were a little bit more tentative about this prediction, but we wanted to determine whether or not attitudes related to errors. So more specifically, our hypotheses for the study were fourfold. First, we believed overall that participants would have greater difficulty reading emotions in the masked condition as compared to the unmasked condition. More specifically, based on past research, we believed that people would struggle with happy, sad, and angry faces in a masked condition as relative to fear, that fear would still be easier to read in a masked condition because of where people are focusing on the eyes. Not yet looked at in the research literature, we believe that participants would have an exceptional difficult time in identifying high intensity expressions in the masked condition relative to unmasked. And then we explored potential individual difference factors to see if the relationships existed between facial recognition errors and internal locus of control and their mask wearing attitudes. And we looked at these relationships both in the masked and unmasked conditions. In terms of our study methodology, we did an experimental design with 287 US American college students. We had a stronger proportion of women, given that most of these participants tended to come from introduction to psychology courses, and social science classes today are more often attended by women than men. We had, in terms of ethnic group, 60% of students white, with 40% in an ethnic minority or non-responding situation. And this campus demographic is relatively representative of our institution. So while we might have cautions about generalizability of this sample, given that we're in a US American college student setting, the representation of the group was fairly representative of what we see for participants in this context. The median age for our sample was 19.5 years old, with students from 50 different majors who were all participating for research credits. And the power for our study was very strong. We sampled more than we needed for this particular aspect of the study, given that the lab is continuing to look at other potential predictors of facial affect recognition errors. And so we oversampled for what we need in this particular study to use as a base for our research moving forward. In terms of measure, we had 3 primary measures. The first was the diagnostic analysis of nonverbal accuracy for faces, or DANVA-2 faces. This study has been used in hundreds, if not thousands, of research projects and shows strong reliability and validity estimates. The DANVA faces test includes 24 adult facial photographs with individuals from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. In this particular study, we superimposed the faces with a disposable mask and utilized a within subjects design. So our participants saw both masked and unmasked faces in batches that were counterbalanced. So some individuals saw the masked faces first, other individuals saw the unmasked faces first to remove practice effects or biases from which set of stimuli they saw first as a potential explanation for the outcomes. We also utilized the adult Nowicki-Strickland internal-external scale to measure locus of control. This has 40 items, and individuals who score higher on this measure have a more external locus of control. This is also a well-validated measure. And because we did not find any measures of mask attitudes yet in the psychology or sociology literature, we created a mask attitude survey for the study. This included 23 items, 12 of which were positively worded and 12 of which were negatively worded. After we reverse scored the half of the items that were negatively worded, a higher score on the mask attitude survey for COVID-19, or MASK, did show more favorable attitudes towards mask wearing. And the Cronbach's for this study was very strong, indicating its use for both research and clinical settings. Lastly, we also looked at demographic items to help identify our participants for the method section and for future studies to possibly look at individual differences by demographics on people's error recognition rates. The descriptive statistics are provided here. For those data heads that really like to look at numbers, you can pause the presentation and take a look at the raw data or have those for your own confirmation or analyses moving forward. I'll note that we have put in bold, it looks like it's repeating, but they're not, for stimuli that were masked versus unmasked. And we will use these statistics as a base for our inferential analyses and hypotheses testing for the study. So in regards to our first and second hypothesis, we found strong support, both that masking made reading facial expressions harder overall. The t-test was very significant with a very large effect size, showing that emotions got harder to read when the masks went on. Moreover, we had a significant interaction between mask condition and emotion type, with main effects for both type and masking condition. In other words, when there are differences in how many errors people make across emotion types, angry is always the hardest emotion for people to read. They make more errors. But when we put masks on, happy errors increase a lot. Sad errors increase, angry errors increase, and fearful errors stay about the same. And this is consistent with what we found in the literature. The take-home message is, fearful emotions are still easy enough to read when masks are on. Everything else is harder, and happy, which used to be really easy without a mask, becomes hard too. So we know that the pattern is changing in a mask situation. In regards to our third hypothesis, we did find strong support as well. There was a significant interaction with a moderate effect size, such that given the main effects that we found, people always made more errors on low intensity faces than they did on high intensity faces. It was always easier to read things in the unmasked condition than the unmasked condition. But especially in the masked condition, reading high intensity or those big, bold facial expressions got hard. It got really difficult. In fact, they tended to start looking more like the low intensity errors with or without the masks. So we are losing something interesting and particularly valuable here when masks go on. It gets hard to read even the most broad, brilliant, exceptional facial expressions when people are wearing masks. Our fourth hypothesis showed partial support. So in terms of locus of control, we did find that people who were more external tended to make more facial recognition errors. This is true in the unmasked condition shown here for errors overall, for angry faces, and for high intensity faces. When we put masks on, the effects become even more predominant. So people show a stronger relationship between errors and external locus of control overall and for more subtypes of emotion. In other words, when masks are on, people who are more external are making significantly more errors than people who are lower on that external scale. So we did not find support, though, for our exploratory analysis on whether people's mask attitudes might be related to their facial recognition errors. Although we did have one small effect when the masks were off between people's facial errors and low intensity emotions, the rest of the findings were not significant. So the take-home message is there was not much overlap or relationship between people's attitudes towards mask wearing and their processing of emotional information from the face. So in take-home, what this means is we found strong support for the study's first three predictions and partial support for the fourth. First off, these masks that people are wearing made facial expression recognition more difficult, especially for happiness and especially for high intensity emotions. And so what this leads us to think about is whether we might need training to specifically read facial emotions with masks better in the world as it exists right now. Or maybe we need to help train people to pay attention to other emotion cues in addition to the face so that they can be processing as much relationship emotional information as they can in day-to-day lives. We also found, in terms of that fourth hypothesis, that greater externality was associated with significantly more facial recognition errors, both in the masked and unmasked conditions, but especially in the masked condition. So we know that masked facial recognition becomes more difficult, and maybe people who are more external are just giving up. They're not working to do more because they're like, I can't do anything about this, masks just stink. Whereas individuals who are more internal might be turning to other resources in order to help make the most of it. Hey, I can't have that person take the mask off, but I can think about other things I can do to help understand how they're feeling. We did not find that those mask wearing attitudes were related to facial recognition errors in either the masked or unmasked conditions. So what does this mean? Well, first off, when you find a pattern of effects, we also start to speculate why. So our research labs, both in Italy and the US, are recognizing that masking is not a socially neutral event. If we look at past studies, participants tend to see more negativity when the face is blocked with a scarf that is a religious or cultural dress, like a niqab, than they do with bubbles or winter hats and scarves. So it's not just a perceptual difficulty. It's not just that the mouth is blocked, but people might be reading into that about the mask wearer. So Fisher et al. And Kret and de Gelder and Kret and Fisher together have looked at people's perception of the person wearing the mask, not just the face and its difficulty in expressing emotion. So there are layers here that we still need to unpack about what it means to be a mask wearer and how we are perceived by others. And our research lab is currently investigating a myriad of other individual differences, both in seeing what predicts facial recognition errors and what predicts mask attitudes and how these might go together. So for example, our studies in the lab are currently looking at age, gender, other samples beside college students, political orientation, conservatism, and entitlement as potential predictors for mask attitudes themselves, and also as predictors for those facial recognition errors and how those two concepts might go together. So stay tuned. We hope to have a couple more studies out in the next few years that help tell us why it's harder to read facial expressions with masks. As far as take-home messages, though, we do have these suggestions based on our research. First, since we're all living in a world with masked faces, there are things that we can do to still process emotions for others. So we might need to focus more intently and purposefully on people's eyes, right? And hone in on what that source of information is giving us in terms of emotions. We can also observe gestures and body posture. Listen carefully to people's tone of voice, or what's called paralanguage in the official nonverbal communication literature, as useful sources of information. And if what we're used to in day-to-day life is processing the face, we need to do more. And so future studies might benefit from looking at whether training would help people to focus non-verbally on other channels in order to help alleviate some of those emotion recognition difficulties that masks bring, and the subsequent social challenges that can come from not being able to read people's feelings. This might be especially important for people in the helping professions, therapists, counselors, medical doctors, school teachers, who need to use those sources of information to best help their clients and constituents. As we wrap up this study, we want to thank you for your time and your choice to join us today in our session when you have a lot of things going on in your world too. We are very grateful to the scientists, essential workers, health providers, and leaders who are helping us all do the very best we can during a global pandemic and a very trying time. We are with you. We don't necessarily feel comfortable in masks and how the world is going either. But while we are here for the foreseeable future, at least we're trying to help understand what's going on and find a way to make it better. My research colleagues and I are grateful to SEPA for the honor of being selected for this special session. And we want to thank specifically Sarah Russo, who helped prepare our mass stimuli, Ashlyn Mendez and Catherine Kennedy, who helped with literature review and providing comments on the manuscript draft that was submitted with the presentation today. For those of you that are interested in following up, my email is on the opening slide. I would be glad to talk with you more about our studies. And if you're interested in the Mask Attitude Survey, that is available for free use for research or student projects. So please be in touch if you'd like to use the Mask Attitude Survey. And my references for my colleagues and I are provided here. I'll flip through them quickly in case there's any particular study you're interested in finding, or the images that we used. And again, if you'd like to follow up with the mask attitude measure or anything about facial recognition, please be in touch. Thank you personally for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and stay safe out there, everyone. This too shall pass.